You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Max Planck Lawcast. I'm not going to give away my exact age, but we could say that during my lifetime, the internet has certainly shifted from being a novelty to a absolutely indispensable everyday tool. The internet connects people from across the globe. It facilitates communication. It has absolutely transformed education and commerce. From streaming episodes of Peppa Pig to researching quantum physics, the internet offers something for everyone. But who controls what not only is said on the internet, but also what we find on the internet? Or better put, who are the internet's global gatekeepers? In today's podcast, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the complex world of online content moderation and discussing its far-reaching implications. From social media platforms to the infrastructure that supports the web itself, the decisions made by content moderators and internet gatekeepers can shape public discourse, influence human rights, and affect our daily lives. My guest on today's program is Erik Tuchtfeld. Erik is a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, which is located in the lovely city of Heidelberg. And he is also head of the HumanNet 3 interdisciplinary research group, which is a research group between three Max Planck institutes working on human-centered digital transformation. I'll actually put a link to the website of HumanNet 3 in the podcast description. So Erik knows a whole lot more about today's topic than I do, and so I'm very glad to have him on to talk about what is a absolute pertinent and very interesting issue. So Erik, welcome to the Lawcast.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Look, for myself, and I would assume probably many of our listeners, online moderation is something that often comes up in discussions concerning social media. Now, I know that platforms such as Facebook or Reddit or X are probably the tip of the iceberg here, but maybe we could set the stage for today's podcast and you could define how and to what extent these forums, which are used in everyday life, moderate the content that can be found on them.
Yes, of course, Chris. And I mean, that already touches upon the very core of my current research. We're talking about today the definition of what content moderation actually is. And I mean, that's kind of a contested concept, and it very much depends. There's no internationally agreed definition, but what I'm working with some minor adjustments, is the definition of the probably most important law about the moderation of content in the digital public, which is Europe's Digital Services Act. So the new law enacted by the European Union on digital services, on the way platforms should moderate content. It's amazing because I've never experienced a law with so much research, like accompanied by so much research already during this process of legislation. There are many new provisions, and researchers are excited not only from law, but also from many other disciplines, behavioral sciences and other disciplines, how this law will affect how we communicate online.
Okay, right, great. So sorry, but I interrupted you there just to get the exact date of the law, but you please continue.
Yeah, exactly. The Digital Services Act does define content moderation. And it's a very long definition, so I'm not going to read it all, but it's mainly about all activities which are aimed in either detecting or identifying, addressing illegal content. So illegal content means content violating state laws, public laws, or content violating the terms and conditions of the respective social media platform, and then deploying particular measures against this kind of content, affecting their availability, visibility, and accessibility. And that's a very, very broad definition, because we don't only have, for example, the removal of content, which is probably the most classic content moderation measures most have in mind, also because it is to some extent the most visible in the sense of making content clearly invisible and inaccessible. Sometimes we have a notification, this post has been removed because it violates community guidelines or something else. We probably all stumbled over that when using social media platforms. But there are also more indirect measures of content moderation. For example, the demonetization of content. So many content creators receive money for the content they publish. And once a social media platform bars them from this possibility. It obviously restricts the visibility of this kind of content because it's not going to be published if they don't receive money for it anymore. Also, we have the whole aspect of algorithmic curation of content. So the content we see online is not simply the last one which was posted, at least not in the preferences used by most people when they're using social media platforms, but it is a recommendation by the platform. And we have this, some describe it as so-called shadow banning, so not an official ban of a piece of content or a user, but an algorithmic demotion of a particular piece. So it's simply not displayed anymore, at least not prominently, to other users. And all of these different measures, demonetization, removal of content, algorithmic curation, so it's not shown prominently, or it is, on the other hand, enforced, so it's shown more prominently. We, for example, have these kind of measures for the content of particularly trustworthy sources, like public broadcasters. All of these measures can be put under the concept of content moderation.
Okay, right, I understand. Okay, so based upon these new laws that have been enacted now, you're saying that there's all kinds of different ways that content is moderated, be it from based on state level where a law's been broken, but also the rules and regulations of platforms themselves. They also then have ways to deal with the moderation of content, be it a blanket ban on something or, as you say, maybe hiding it in the corner so it's not found so easily.
Exactly. And it's not only under the new laws. I just use the definition of the Digital Services Act, but it is a practice as old as the internet, basically. Also, like in Usenet groups at the very beginning of the internet, there was already discussions about which content should be able to stay online and when and under which circumstances particular pieces of content must be removed because they violate personality rights, because they're considered hate speech, infringing the personal dignity of others. It's a very, very old discussion. But now we have at least one legal definition of what content moderation is.
Okay, well, then let's, if we're going to go back to the Usenet days, the bulletin board days, let's dig a little deeper now. We've kind of scratched the surface. You've given us a nice definition of how we should understand internet content moderation, at least talking about social media and the like. You sent me a bunch of draft papers that you were currently working on, and one term that I came across while reading them and preparing for today's episode was about the internet stack. Could you explain this concept and elaborate on how this stack affects broader discussions on online content moderation?
Yes, of course. The internet stack is one way to understand the structure, the architecture of the internet. I mean, it's to a large extent not visible to us, apart from our screens we are looking on directly, and maybe we have an image in mind that there are some cables must be somewhere underneath our feet so that information can be transmitted. But to a large extent, it's quite difficult to grasp how the internet works.
Absolutely. I always think it's just lots of computers all kind of connected somewhere and doing their thing.
And it's all magic.
Yeah, that's right.
But it is not as easy as this. And it's a lot about power. The internet stack is also a lot about power, and content moderation is about power. That is also why it interests me. And the stack is one very popular model, how to explain how the internet is built. And it's not one very fixed or defined model. It's more like a general concept, working with different layers, building up on each other. And the one we are most used to, because that's the one we see and we experience in our day-to-day life, is the application layer. And this consists of like very individual social media pages or, for example, websites we are browsing on, and we experience and we see the content, and it's quite clear who's responsible for the content we see. Could be social media pages, could be social media profiles, stuff like that. Then one layer beneath are the social media platforms. I mean, that's still something. To access a particular social media profile of a certain user, we have to access the platform. It's both application layer because it's directly used as an application by the users. So then it becomes a bit more invisible and the infrastructural layer starts. And what I personally understand as the first infrastructure layer, some would call this an application layer, but let's not get too much into the detail, are the app stores, the payment services, the search engines. And obviously, those are all services we directly use. So we directly interact with them. But we normally don't use them as an end in itself. So we only use them to access the content provided then by a social media platform or by an individual user, an individual profile or something similar. So that's why I would consider them infrastructure. They're not an end in itself, but only a way to access other content.
Okay, but something we still come in touch with as internet users, maybe not on a daily basis, but we still, obviously, this is a layer we still see for the end user.
Exactly. And that is why it is to some extent not black or white in this application layer, infrastructure layer dichotomy, but more in the gray zone. And it becomes more black and white with regard to infrastructure layers when we talk about, for example, web hosting services. All services on the internet are somewhere hosted on web servers. And these web servers can become super important because, when I'm publishing a small website because I'm a doctor or I'm a researcher and I want to present my own research and I have 10 persons per day looking at my website, I can host it anywhere and it's not a problem. But having a popular social media platform, there are very few web hosting services in the world, like 3 or 4, which can provide services that stable that millions of users can access such a social media platform. So it's already a highly concentrated market.
Okay. And these are also private companies, I gather, right?
Exactly. These are private companies. So the most important ones are, for example, Amazon with the Amazon Web Services. Most know them because we've talked about this, because they experience their online shopping there.
That's right. We talked about before the program.
Exactly.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They are also very, very important for the hosting of services, of other services.
This is the cloud we're talking about there. Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure.
Exactly. Cloud is a very blurry concept and people understand very different things under cloud, but it's cloud services. The one you're naming are the big ones. And that already means that we are one layer down, like we are going down the stack. And now we've found a new layer, explored a new layer, the web hosting services. And when we go a little bit more to the bottom, then we come to the domain name system, the DNS, which is very important so that we can even find a website. So we just type mpil.de if you want to access our institute's website. But somebody, and that is what the DNS, the domain name system does, needs to translate these human-readable names to a machine-readable format, to an IP address.
Okay. That's true, because back in the day, again, I won't say how old I am, but back in the day, we had to always type in this HTTP ... // and you're right. Now it's a much more straightforward process.
Exactly. The HTTP, that's just a protocol. So it's not so much related to the question of typing an IP address or typing a human readable name, but it goes into a similar direction to make it as easy for users to access content. It's basically an address. You need to know where to go. And I don't know exactly how navigation systems work, but I guess when you type in a human readable address, like for the Heidelberg Institute, im Neuenheimer Feld 535 in Heidelberg, then it translates this into geographical information like GPS coordinates. And that's basically the same what happens in the internet when you type in an URL. So a URL, something like ample.de, it's translated into an IP address, and this IP address then links to a very specific server where the website is hosted. And then the particular website can be brought to you and on your own client on your mobile phone.
Basically, there's a company or an organization that then owns all these DNS. Was that what you said?
DNS, yeah. Domain name system.
They're responsible for doling out domain names as well? Or?
Exactly. So it's a distributed system. So we have the ICANN. They're mainly in charge of the so-called top-level domains, which would be, for example, DE, so the very end of the domain. And then we have a German organization, the DENIC, where you can actually buy a certain domain, in this example, ample, and then you have ample.de. And when you ask your browser, okay, I want to access ample.de, the browser will first ask the ICANN, who's in charge of the DE domain, and then it comes to the DENIC, and then it asks DENIC, okay, who's in charge of ample, and then the DENIC will tell you where to find this particular website.
Right. So this is all these layers. I mean, we haven't even dug to the very bottom of the stack yet, but all these layers, they're all talking to each other constantly, basically, and we're working on this infrastructure layer.
Exactly. That is completely true. And that's also a way to control how we can reach certain websites or reach certain content, because in practice, not every time we type something in, the icon is asked, where's this website? But in practice, most telecommunication providers do this. So they have a so-called DNS resolver. So they resolve the DNS, the domain name, to a certain IP address. And when you don't want a particular website to be accessed, for example, because it contains illegal content, then you can ask or you can order as a state the telecommunication provider to not resolve this particular DNS or to resolve it to another aim. So, for example, then when you're trying to access an illegal website, it's not the actual server of the website which is displayed to you with all the illegal content, but just the notification of your telecommunication provider that you're not allowed to access this website. That's why the telecommunication provider won't resolve it.
So that's the type of moderation then that's happening at the infrastructure layer.
Exactly. That's one type of content moderation by the telecommunication providers. And now we're coming to the very bottom. We were always talking about software and about protocols. But obviously, we also have physical telecommunication infrastructure, like in the ground. We have cables in the ground. We have, to a certain extent, satellites, which are used to enabling us to communicate with each other. And measures taken at this level, like, for example, simply physical measures of destroying particular kinds of infrastructure, also impede our possibilities to access certain kind of content, because then we don't have access to the internet at all.
Okay, so that's kind of a hardware layer as well, if you will.
Exactly.
Yes, okay. The computers themselves, the graphics, the servers, do they also fit in this layer or are they elsewhere?
The computers themselves, I would consider them being part of the application layer. And when it comes to the graphics, we've seen like all the colors displayed, that is all controlled by the application layer. I mean, when I access a certain website, the website tells the client meaning the computer, please display me in blue and show some nice fonts, and please display the text and the content I wish to transmit to the user.
Okay, right. So if we get to the very bottom of the stack, which I also thought looked a bit like a hamburger in the pictures that I found. That's how I kind of worked through it. You had the kind of the bun at the top, which is your application layer, and you worked all the way down until you got to this hardware infrastructure layer at the very bottom. Okay. Well, you mentioned there, thank you very much for giving that breakdown of the stack. I hope that our listeners can use either your breakdown or my breakdown of a hamburger, but I think we definitely understand that when we're pulling something up, there's a lot of wheels and pulleys and mechanisms that are being used in the background when I go online to look at a web page. You also said briefly there about some options there to moderate things where you and I generally on our top level, we just see, someone's post has been deleted for violating community guidelines. But could you take a moment to then explain in a little bit more detail? You talked there about like cutting wires, for instance, or cables underneath the ground, but that would obviously be an extreme resolution. But other ways that then content is moderated at the application. So when we leave the application layer and go deeper down into the infrastructural layers.
I think what always helps me, like as a general method to understand and to approach a certain problem, is to think about the extremes. And the one extreme on the application layer, when it comes to content moderation, the one extreme would be I'm personally moderating content on my social media profile. Somebody comments on my personal post and not the social media platform, but I myself remove this post because I don't like it. That's a very individual measure of content moderation, but I can deploy it, and sometimes I do because I don't like what certain people post, and it's fine. It's just one possible content moderation measures. That's the one extreme, like the most individual level.
That's the very, very top of the hamburger bun.
Very, very top. And then when we want to go to the other extreme, that would be probably physical telecommunication infrastructure, or at least on this telecommunication provider level. And what we've seen there, for example, and I think we will probably talk about this in more detail also later in the podcast, is internet shutdowns. States, governments, they are unhappy about certain kind of content online, often because they think that, for example, protesters are connecting themselves, are organizing themselves, organizing their protests online, or are asking the government critical questions or criticizing the government very fiercely online. And at a certain point, the government is that unhappy about the situation that it decides, okay, I simply don't want them to access internet anymore. And then it simply shuts the internet down completely. So there's no access to the internet anymore. Or like with some variants, it, for example, throttles the internet, which means that it makes it slower and slower so that you can still send some text messages and have basic access to the internet. But for example, cannot share any photos or videos of human rights violations, for example. The police is attacking massively demonstrators, but then you cannot share the videos or the pictures because they are too big and you have very, very slow, throttled internet.
Okay. So they make it a bare bones, let's say, throttled way of then using the internet. Okay. Or is that then primarily, though, governments who can make decisions there on what they want to be seen or found? Or are we also talking about private companies as well? Or a telecommunications provider could also make a decision here?
Exactly. Like empirically, it is mostly controlled by state governments. It is telecommunications providers who are doing this. And for example, in Germany, they're privatized. But even in Germany, there's a strong grip of the government on the provision of telecommunication service because it's such an essential, it's a basic service for the humans in the country. And in many states, telecommunication providers are not even private. They're simply government owned. And then when they execute such measures, they do this on a direct order of governments. That is how it has been in the past. When we it's very early in this podcast. Normally it's the very end to have an outlook. But what we can see is an increasing privatization also of such internet infrastructure. When we think about Starlink, for example, the service by Elon Musk to provide internet online via satellite, that is completely in private hands. And we have seen now, for example, in the Ukraine war, how important such a completely private service can become to provide, or either because he's in a bad mood, not provide access to the internet anymore.
Yeah, it's a very pertinent point you bring up there. That's right. And then the question is, of course, this is not a traditional service provider or a telecommunications company that necessarily operates under, let's say, German law in this case, and maybe the German law cannot stop them from providing internet. Is that correct? Or that could also be an issue, right?
At least not factually. This might spark a discussion about the normative power of the facts, the normative Kraft des Faktischen. But that is in general a problem or a challenge when it comes to the regulation of content online, that most of these measures, also of content moderation measures, in particular of blocking measures, can be circumvented. For example, when we talk about domain name systems and the resolving of a particular domain to a certain IP address, which then links you to a server, when your own telecommunication provider blocks you from accessing a certain website, you can use something like a virtual private network, a VPN, to then use basically another telecommunication provider, to not rely on the domain name resolving of your own telecommunication providers. So there are certain technical measures to circumvent also blocking or other content moderation measures.
Maybe when we talked about the final layer, though, which is physical cables in the ground and whatnot, they previously probably couldn't have been circumvented, but let's see what happens in the future, because maybe they will also be able to be circumvented. But that's probably a question for another podcast. We're going to go to a quick break. Well, actually, before we go to a break, though, I wanted to ask, you've explained to us that there's a lot of ways that these gatekeepers, whether they be private or public, can moderate and control what we read, what we find, what we see online, what we share. Before we go to the break, though, I'd like to ask, could you maybe give us an example of some real-world content moderation occurring at the various layers of the stack? So we're not just simple, this could happen, but actually this has happened.
Yeah. So I will focus on the infrastructure layers, because I think on the application layers, we all are aware of everyday content moderation measures, the removal of posts, for example. When we talk about infrastructure content moderation, on the very first infrastructure content moderation layer, we can, for example, take a look at the practices of app stores. And app stores, it's a highly concentrated market. They are basically two app stores used by 99% of the world's population, at least in the more or less liberal states. China, for example, has its own system.
Oh, they have their own system. Okay. But we basically have Apple.
Exactly.
App Store and Alphabet or Google.
Exactly. The Play Store used on Android devices. And when the two of them decide that they don't want to host a particular app anymore or want to give users the opportunity to install this app, billions of smartphone users cannot, at least not easily, as I said, there are always circumvention measures, but at least not easily install this app anymore, receive updates, things like that. And that has happened in the past, for example, with Parler, which is a right-wing social media network. So they have removed this app from the app stores. I think also Telegram, because they were unhappy with how Telegram moderated content on its platform messaging service. Is very controversial what it is exactly. And then they decided, okay, if Telegram does not take any measures, then we will take a measure and we will remove it from our app store. Those are measures which have happened in the past.
It made me think when you said that, my son, because 2 years ago or something, it was about Fortnite. And I mean, that was removed also for probably, and had nothing to do with content moderation, but with simple payments. But that, I guess, shows the power of the app stores, as you say, to moderate what's downloaded or what's available.
It's an excellent example also because my idea is to not only talk about political freedoms, not only freedom of speech, freedom of expression, what we mainly focus on, and what is, of course, like at the core of when we talk about content moderation on Telegram or right-wing networks like Parler, but also about other rights and freedoms, for example, the right to conduct a business. And there were very strong anti-competitive measures deployed. I'm not sure if from Google and Apple, or only one of the both, but they were in strong conflict.
I think it was certainly Apple, certainly removed it, I think. That's right, yeah. And I don't know if it's back again, but I think that was the thing because the transactions were not then occurring through the App Store. Then they were like, not happening. So as I just say, it's quite interesting. There's the power of these companies. It's not politics. It's definitely not just politics. It's also commerce.
I completely agree. And it's interesting because it also shows the need for interdisciplinary research on this topic, also from a legal perspective, because monopolies in the private market are a classical subject of competition law. But power about public discourse, is also a classical subject of public law. And that is, like, public law is my perspective. But as you mentioned in the beginning, we're working in this interdisciplinary group here, Human 3, and we also have a competition lawyer, because I think it's so important when we talk about private power, we need to debate it from different perspectives and to deploy different mechanisms of law.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. The internet touches every part of our life, doesn't it? I mean, that's right. So I think it makes sense to take an interdisciplinary approach.
Exactly. Maybe to bring in one other example, because I've talked about the internet shutdowns. India is known as the biggest democracy of the world, but also as the country with the most internet shutdowns in the world. And my impression is when we talk about such more authoritarian measures, we often look to the global south and see, okay, the state of internet freedom there is not so good. We can check certain measures of the European Union and also of our neighboring states and also of Germany itself, reflect on them critically. For example, the European Union has banned Russia Today in the aftermath of the Ukraine war. But I want to make clear, I'm not saying that all these content moderation and all these bans are bad per se. I'm not on this normative level yet. We'll come to this probably later in the podcast. But it is for certain a very, very strict measure, very broad and general effects, like completely blocking, disabling access to a certain TV channel, and may it be just a state propaganda TV channel, is a very intrusive measure and affects the freedoms and rights of many, many people who want to access this source of information or disinformation, but wants to access the source.
No, that's right. And it's a slippery slope argument, isn't it? It's like, at what point do I say, this source or this content shouldn't be allowed? I'm guessing it's not necessarily discussed publicly, or who makes a decision on this. I mean, obviously in an authoritarian regime, it's even more straightforward, but even on closing Russia Today, for instance, I don't know, seemed to be that was something that just happened. There was no discussion about it. It just happened.
It was based on a law enacted by the European Parliament, like the European legislator. So there is some democratic legitimacy to it. But at the same time, I would still say that there was a lack of public discussion about it. And it was very much focused on this. We want now to protect ourselves from Russian influence, and not so much about what does this say about our state as a liberal democracy when we start to ban certain TV channels.
We could certainly get to the same ban at the end, but maybe, as you say, the lack of public discussion or discourse about this is the kind of somewhat scary.
Yeah, what might be even more under the radar of many was that in New Caledonia, which belongs to France but not to the European Union, which is very important from a legal perspective. There were big uprise, big protests a while ago, and the French government decided to completely ban TikTok because of it, because it said there's so much information spread via TikTok, which leads to these kind of violent protests, and that's why we completely block a social media platform. And I mean, there are many perspectives on this. I think also from a post-colonial perspective, it's quite interesting. I don't think that such a measure would be deployed without any bigger debate within Europe on French territory. But in New Caledonia, they simply did it because they could.
They could. That's it. Yeah. So, Erik, you've just talked to us there about some of the human rights implications of content moderation on the internet. We'll take a short break now, and then you'll come back and give us some more on this fascinating world of internet moderation and where it's going in the future.
Max Planck Law is a network of Max Planck Institutes engaging in legal research. The first of these was established in Berlin in 1924. Today, we cover a broad range of legal studies, from the anthropology of law to tax law. We operate one of the world's largest programs for doctoral and postdoctoral research in law. Visit our website today at law.mpg.de.
So, welcome back to the Lawcast. I'm joined today by Erik Tuchtfeld, and we are talking all about the world of internet moderation. Right, so Erik, before the break, you really opened my eyes, certainly, to the fact that our internet has the ability to be moderated and controlled to a far greater degree than I previously thought possible. How, let's say, an internet there's a shutdown or content is moderated that maybe shouldn't have been moderated. How are moderation gatekeepers held accountable for their actions? And does this level of accountability maybe shrink the further we go down the stack and the less we can see of what's actually going on deep below in our little hamburger of content moderation?
It's a very good and very complicated question, Chris, because as a good lawyer, obviously, my answer is it depends. And it depends a lot. When we, for example, talk about content moderation on the application level by social media platforms, there has been a rise of judgments on such content moderation measures in Europe and beyond, for example, also in Latin America, on the fundamental rights, obligations of these social media platforms. And the basic argument is they have so much power about public discourse. Some call them the public town squares of our digital times, that they also need to respect fundamental rights, human rights, at least to a certain extent. From a German doctrinal perspective, the so-called indirect effects of human rights or horizontal effects of human rights. And courts in Germany and in Italy and many other European and, as I said, also Latin American and other countries of the world, courts have obliged platforms, for example, to reinstate content they have removed before, because in the opinion of the courts, this content moderation decision was an interference with the right to freedom of expression and was not justified. It was an unjustified exercise of power. This is, for example, very much different in the United States. In the United States, they have very famously laws, Section 230, and this law shields platforms completely from their liability when it comes to content moderation, which also means that they are not accountable for removing content which is maybe not deemed illegal or which is not in violation of terms and conditions, or for not removing content, leaving hate speech online. Also, that is something from a German perspective, you can also obligate a platform to remove a certain piece of content if it disturbs you and if it is in violation of the law, and something like that is not working in the United States. So it very much depends on the legal regime you're based in.
But that would then again mean, say, for instance, that if, let's take X, but we don't have to, we can say Reddit or Facebook, is they're told to remove content, then they might have to remove that in the European Union or in Germany. But if I then go the VPN route and say I'm in America, then that content is still available for me.
That's a very good separate question, the question of extraterritoriality of such decisions. And at least according to a European understanding, European courts can order Facebook or other services to remove content worldwide. And that is to a certain extent problematic. They're really both sides. I can understand why, like from the perspective of protecting, for example, the right to personal reputation, to protecting it effectively, I want to have lies about me removed, not only in Austria. I mean, there's one case in Austria, that's why I'm mentioning Austria, or not only in Germany, but worldwide. I don't want like lies about me being spreading anywhere.
Sure, I understand that 100%. That's right. But do I have a legal right then, if that legal right only exists in Austria or in Germany, to have someone who wants to read about me and the lies being spread about me in America to stop them from doing so? Yeah.
The legal right is you have, and at least in Europe, you have such a legal right, but it's also problematic because, like, assuming that such a legal right exists everywhere, like all national jurisdiction can transfer such a like global legal right to individuals, there's a lot of potential for abuse, and it basically might lead to a race to the bottom. And whenever they're like in some authoritarian state, you criticize the leader of the state, and then the leader sues you or sues the platform and asks the platform to remove the content, and then you can not only make the content inaccessible in the country, but even worldwide, remove it worldwide. And this could really impede global public discourse. It's a problem. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, 100%. And then who's to say what content then should be removed? Because if we're saying, well, this content is because it offends us and our sensibilities and our laws, then we could have someone somewhere else saying, well, the same applies to me. It's quid pro quo. It offends me, my rules, my laws, then you've got to ban it in Europe as well.
Absolutely true. That is probably one of the most complicated dilemmas of global platforms and global content moderation. At the same time, many argue that it's, and I think there's to a certain extent it's true, that it's an overstated problem, that it's mainly a theoretical problem, because while many argue that we're now existing or experiencing and discussing on global virtual town squares, the de facto situation is that often we are still discussing national issues, and we are discussing with people who are living in the same, more or less the same jurisdiction like we do. So it's only to a certain extent true that there is some kind of global discourse. It does exist, but most of the debates are still somehow touching upon local, regional, national issues. And thus, for example, removing the defamation against a particular politician is in the end still to some extent a matter of like this national policy.
Sure. And then they have to then work cooperatively, though, with the host providers, the ISPs, with the platforms to try and make this work, though, obviously. I mean, or is there I guess there's also the heavy stick approach where they say you can't operate here in our country anymore, or in Europe anymore.
Exactly. Those are basically the layers of escalation. Like from a European perspective, platforms normally comply. I mean, there's a lot of debate about compliance, for example, by X at the moment, but they're not. It's also a mode of contestation. There may be, there's a lot of open question about what does which rule exactly mean and stuff like that, but they are in discourse with European legislation, simply because Europe is a very important economic market and they want to earn money. And for that, they need to be compliant with the laws, more or less. It becomes way more difficult when we look at countries from the global south, because they sometimes ask platforms or their judges order platforms to remove certain kind of content. And the platforms don't cooperate, sometimes for good reasons, because they think that such a piece of content is protected by freedom of expression. And then they don't cooperate. And then the states only have limited measures at hand, what they can do then, because obviously they can also fine the platforms, but platforms won't pay them. And what they do then as a measure of last resort, one could call it, but still unproportionate in my opinion, is blocking the service as a whole, because such a service which is not compliant is something they don't want in their country.
I see. Yes, that's right. So we've got to get to the throttling or the, as you say, blocking entirely. Well, which brings me, I guess, to internet shutdowns and maybe the fact that certain countries rely on them, maybe for good reason, that there's no other option available to them to have content moderated. The shutdowns are something that you, in particular, interested in your work, and you've done like a lot of case studies on them. What I was quite interested to find, though, you also touched on the fact that shutdowns have a major impact on human rights. And I guess with internet moderation, we definitely think laws could be breached and whatnot, but human rights is maybe not something that is always brought to mind when we're talking about moderation and shutdowns. So what do you mean by this, that shutdowns affect or can have such a heavy-handed effect on human rights?
Yeah, my impression of the current discourse on content moderation is that it is a human rights discourse to a certain extent, but that it's very much focused on freedom of expression. As counterpart censorship, which is normally what platforms are accused of when people perceive their moderation as too heavy and moderating legitimate or legal content. But I think that there's more. And there's in particular more, once again, I use this method of looking at the extreme, and then I think you can draw a lot of insights also for less restrictive measures. When we look at the extreme of internet shutdowns, the most extreme, severe kind of content moderation, one could say, we can really tell that they're normally deployed because people, governments, have a problem with certain opinions or with certain political freedoms exercised online. But they have massive side effects, for example, on the right to health, on the right to food, on the right to work. For example, many people are relying in today's economy on using some kind of online platform to have their work organized, so-called gig workers. For example, if you want to buy food on Lieferando or on Uber Eats or anywhere.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's the whole gig economy, right? I mean, with, organizing Uber or doing a side job, delivering food, probably you're not necessarily, I mean, there's a discussion about whether they're employed or not, but they're doing side hustles,
Exactly. And it is their work. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of question when it comes to work conditions, but factually, they're earning their money.
It occurs entirely digitally.
Exactly. And once the internet is gone, they are not earning money anymore. They're completely like from one day to the other, and without having any direct connection to the actual conflict, they do completely lose their ability to earn money and their job, basically. The same with the right to health. When much health information is by now organized digitally, for example, in databases, the health insurances have databases with health information which doctors can access when they have a patient coming in. And once the internet is gone, the doctors can not only access this information about the particular patient anymore, but at the same time can, for example, not check their insurance state anymore. So the health of individuals is put into risk by such a restrictive measure. And also when it comes to the right to food, to nutrition, food subsidies are often organized in online systems where it is like big registers where it is put who has the privilege, in quotation marks, to get access to food subsidies, to receive some kind of public support. And once all these registers are not available anymore, the distribution of food really becomes very difficult. And that's not just a theoretical problem. It's a practical problem which was observed in those areas where the internet was either shut down completely or limited only to certain very narrow areas or throttled, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then what happens, though, to international companies, for instance? Maybe they're not involved or affected at all, but if country X decides that they want to throttle their internet or they want to shut it down entirely, some communication companies are still obviously purely in the hand of a country or a government. But let's say others are not. I mean, we have a whole lot of different companies working here on the stack. What are the obligations then of international companies that are told to enforce something which then they feel, no, this clearly violates human rights? I mean, that seems to put them into a very difficult position.
Exactly. It's a dilemma for companies operating in states with deficiencies when it comes to rule of law procedures. Because, I mean, normally what a company has to do in such a situation, and we now had, for example, a big debate about X in Brazil, because a Brazilian court has ordered X to remove certain accounts, and X didn't do that. And then the court decided, the Supreme Court actually decided to then block X entirely for a couple of weeks, I think, before the ban was lifted again.
The things were being discussed that the government in Brazil didn't like on X?
Yeah, it was the case that certain accounts were understood to spread hate and disinformation. And that is why the Supreme Court, it was a Supreme Court investigation, wanted X to remove these accounts.
Okay, and so then that puts then X, which is probably one of the proprietors of the public town square. I mean, that's definitely, I think that was why Twitter itself was founded even under that concept, to have absolute open free speech, and people should be able to say anything. And then there's suddenly a government here which is saying, no, not here. And then rather than compromising, they've said simply, you're gone. Like maybe in Europe, they'd find a compromise and work on an arrangement. But here in this case, they were stopped entirely. And then, so this puts then X in a position where they have to say, decide which human rights do we honor and which do we not.
The concrete example is even a bit more difficult because X did not challenge the Brazilian decision. Brazil is still a relatively well-working democracy, as far as I'm aware. So when they're confronted with such an administrative act or a judgment they are not agreeing with, there are mechanisms like rule of law mechanisms to challenge such a judgment. And that is what X, for example, did not do. So they're simply, I think it was also because some kind of personal fight between the judge in question and Elon Musk. Elon Musk decided, okay, this is all censorship. He's not complying at all. He's not even challenging these measures in court. But that's not working. I mean, also social media networks, they in general need to comply with the laws of the countries they're operating in. That's also like from a democratic perspective, like democratic countries can enact certain rules. And for example, when it comes to freedom of expression is simply not the same worldwide. We have different understandings of freedom of expression in the United States and in Europe already. And when we look like across the globe, there are many different understandings. What are certain limitations of freedom of expression and possible limitations of freedom of expression? From a German perspective, for example, the denial of Holocaust is a crime, and that is something considered to be a justified limitation on freedom of expression. And then I think that platforms should generally honor such democratic decisions about laws and limitation to freedom of expression. But there are obviously also certain measures or certain interferences with these human rights, for example, freedom of expression, which go beyond of what is justified. And in countries where there is no acceptable state of the rule of law and where you cannot simply challenge such a decision by the government or by a certain judge you're not agreeing with, and then the next judge, the higher instance, will say, okay, that was simply not compatible with human rights, and we annul this judgment or administrative acts. And then it becomes very complicated. What do services do when they want to operate in a country where there is no rule of law and where there is no or limited respect for human rights? And we have seen, for example, in China, because obviously now comes the economic part, China is a very important market, that services, for example, Google with its search engine, then adjust the search results to be in compliance with what the Chinese government wants from a perspective of freedom of expression, freedom of information. This is really a problem because this simply gives authoritarian governments their way.
Mm-hmm. That's right, especially the more powerful they are, the heavier the club they swing. And that then means that countries are bound, even if they find it ethically difficult to swallow, they will, simply based also on commercial interests, not always, I just say X was an example where that wasn't the case, but will honour human rights commitments or lack thereof on a country-by-country basis.
Yeah, I would say that in most cases, social media platforms, at least when it's an important, a relevant economic market for them, they honor the national laws. But when it comes to content moderation, also national law, like law in general, in many cases only provides a frame. So there's still a lot of leeway where platforms can decide if they want to remove certain content, which is so-called awful but lawful. So it is within the limits defined by the national law, but might be considered not acceptable for the platform because of other standards. And then it comes to the question, how do they execute their own leeway, their own margin of appreciation, one could say, their own private power. And what we've seen now since roughly 10 years, more or less, is that more and more of these private companies individually and themselves voluntarily commit to human rights. They have so-called corporate social responsibility or corporate human rights policies, where they commit themselves to established human rights instruments, in particular those protecting civil and political liberties, but also instruments against discrimination against women or against racial discrimination. These kinds of commitments, they are voluntary in the first place, but they can also become important when it comes to the legal enforcement of user rights, because these commitments can become part of the community guidelines. And the community guidelines, from a legal perspective, are simply terms and conditions. And at least from a European perspective, terms and conditions can be enforced. So when they don't honor their voluntary commitments, and they have done it in a way that they become legally binding between the two individual, the user and the platform, negotiating, in quotation, like they're not really negotiating, but they're agreeing on a contract, and the terms and conditions are the basis of this contract. And when the human rights instrument becomes part of the terms and conditions, it becomes part of the contract. And then when an action, a moderation measure, is in violation of an international human rights instrument, it becomes a simple contract violation. One could sue the platform in a national court.
Drawing to an end here, but I did want to quickly come back to the shutdowns and from the effect on gig workers and the digital economy. I mean, is there any blowback in countries where you said India is the king of shutdowns, which is totally new to me? I mean, obviously, this is also a very, very damaging commercial human rights. I mean, there's the livelihood of people. Is there any way that the little person can do anything about this, or you just have to suck it up, basically?
I think it's very good that there is public debate about it. And this debate is sparked largely by civil society organizations, in particular in those countries. For example, in India, I can give a big shout out to the Internet Freedom Foundation, a very important organization in India, activists, but working legally. So they're also doing strategic litigation for free access to information and the internet. So they're doing great work, and they're also doing this in coalitions with partners, civil society partners around the world. And there is, for example, one big project by Access Now, tracking internet shutdowns worldwide. And it's a great source of information, simply also for researchers. And we can see that the international instruments for protecting freedom of expression, for protecting access to the internet, they often refer to these sources of information. And then also, before the United Nations, for example, call for a stop of such internet shutdowns and clearly label them as disproportionate. Obviously, we come into a very complex discussion about the effects of international law and human rights law in general. But I think it's a good starting point, at least, to have mechanisms which clearly label what is deemed illegal and what is deemed legal and proportionate. And this could be a starting point to then also lead to a situation where less countries deploy such measures, which are generally by the international community considered disproportionate.
Okay, yeah, no, that's very positive to hear that there is at least a logbook, so to say, of these measures, and so that maybe change can be brought about there. Which would then lead me to my final question, which has to do with the future of content moderation. I mean, we've seen rapid evolution of technology, social media. We discussed already here from where internet was previously something that went along a telephone line made of copper to now fiber optics and now satellites. I mean, things are changing, and the way the internet can be moderated is changing. What do you think the future then of content moderation practices holds, and what advice would you have for stakeholders?
I think we're at a super difficult moment in time at the moment, because we can see that there's a lot of very hateful, very harmful content on the internet. So content where we wish for more content moderation, or where I personally think more content moderation is desirable. At the same time, we can also see a rise of authoritarian governments, institutions, which are always trying to limit freedom of expression and also other fundamental rights, particular political rights. So very much accepting that content moderation is necessary, I think that we should think more about the structure and the architecture of our social media platforms, of the digital town squares of our time, and less about the concrete pieces of content and if they are desirable or not. And that is often discussed under the umbrella term of content agnostic measures. But the idea behind that is, and I think it's convincing to a certain extent, that it's not so much the individual piece of content, but the general dynamics, the systemic structure of social media platforms, which lead to these increase of hate, to debates which cannot be considered constructive anymore. And we need to find out more about this structure and how we can change the structure to make constructive dialogue possible in a better way. And one element of this is also that we need to reduce the addictive design of certain social media platforms, which leads us to staying on them for longer and longer periods of time without actually bringing any benefit to personal health or personal state of information or similar things. So we should think more about the actual structure and architecture of online social media platforms and try to improve it in a way that it benefits societies, in particular democratic societies, which are based on debate and also controversial debate, but in a healthy way.
Making the internet healthy again, if it ever was. I'm not sure. But Erik, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed the podcast. I learned so much about content moderation. It's really knowledgeable. Thank you. And then do send me the links when you finished your papers, and I'll put them up in the podcast description.
I will definitely. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.